And so what the AI says is that the majority of the 72 collected affidavits support the view that something far more extraordinary happened. The witnesses described some physical evidence and events that defy a mundane explanation. There are many base personnel recalled debris with baffling qualities and memory metal. This is old. We know this already. I think it's been covered endlessly to death, right? It's been on Unsolved Mysteries, There's been movies. But it said many of these witnesses risk reputation and previously their clearance to come forward, often late in life or via sealed affidavits. They are signed affidavits, and these are legal documents, by the way, and they have been scanned. There's chain of custody, and they're available easily. Some were threatened by gunpoint. The children were traumatized deeply, the witnesses. There's something very deep here. I believe myself, we're only seeing the surface of what actually happened. It was bigger than what we realized. Even the best research from Freeman only uncovered a little bit of what's really happened.
Welcome. I'm here with Richard Geldreich. Richard, welcome, my friend.
Oh, how you doing? Thanks, Sean.
All right. You've been on a few live streams, but you've never actually been on like a pre-recorded formal interview. So with that in mind, just if you could provide the audience with a brief bio of your background.
Yeah, I'm a programmer. I've been programming since 1985. I did a lot of data compression work and MS-DOS image stuff in the 90s. Then I went into video games. I have coded some really big games like Age of Empires series, Halo Wars, CSGO, Dota 2. I've worked on a lot of data compression code for various companies, optimization work at SpaceX. And these days I'm doing image and texture compression for several tech companies. And my work now is usually open source. And also in my spare time, I work on UAP research for fun.
Now, using that coding background and using that interest in UAP research, you're starting to kind of find novel uses of AI to leverage what's out there and get some actionable insights about what's really going on. So just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. And so a couple of years ago, when ChatGPT came out, my friends and I were really excited. We were like, okay, they split the atom, right, in AI. And so I was like, how can we use this to accelerate UAP research? And there's some really simple things you can do that are they're not controversial. For example, it's really good at translation. So what I was doing at the time, and I still am, is just finding lost data on archive.org and old websites and things like that. So I found French chronologies, and I found some Spanish material, some material in other languages, like German. And I'm like, okay, well, AI is perfect for this. It's like virtually meant for this. I was getting the best results I'd ever seen with translations using OpenAI's products. And so I got a chronology from a French researcher. It was quite large, many thousands of records. It's about UAP and somewhat the history of flight as well, but mostly UAP. And so it was in French, translated each individual record with OpenAI. And I was like using the API for that from C++, which is a programming language, more of a low-level programming language. And from there, I was hooked. So other things that I've done, and by the way, I've released all of the results of this work onto GitHub, which is a site for sharing source code that a lot of open source developers use. It's very, very popular. And so you can see the results there. And I've also made the results searchable. I have a website for that, but I'm not here to, talk much about that unnecessarily. But I just want to say that there are some very reliable uses of AI. So there's translation, there's extracting locations, names, dates, and events. Now, there's already non-AI software or libraries to do that kind of stuff. But what I found is that the UFO chronologies, the UFO records, some of them are so old that the locations don't exist, or there's a huge amount of variability in how the dates and times and locations and stuff are represented in there. Sometimes there are multiple, sometimes there are few. There's all these different, there's no standards, right? It's just kind of a mess. So what AI helps a researcher do when you're taking that kind of unstructured data and trying to structure it, which is what I've been doing, is to help you rapidly get some kind of structure. Because like as a human, I'm not going to sit here and go through 5,000 or 10,000. That's, by the way, the scale we're talking about for some of these chronologies. I can't go through every single one and sit there it's just impractical. Even a team of people, they would just go out of their mind, right? AI helps get rid of a lot of that drudgery. So those are the basic things, right? And also in my work, I do a lot of optimization problems, a lot of math problems. And I'm finding that as time goes by, it gets better and better and better at doing that kind of work. I've also used it to create a lot of Python scripts, and I've experimented, and that's another programming language, for a variety of tasks, such as scraping, data and things like that, or converting data from one format to another. So you can kind of get an idea. It's like OpenAI's products, and to a lesser extent, some of the other ones like Grok and Claude. They just give you, it's like outsourcing, right? To a fuzzy, sometimes unreliable, but amazingly reliable if you use it right, engine. It's like an inference engine is how I look at it.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com.
But I just want to say up front, let's just put this out there. If you are a debunker, you can use AI to debunk incredibly well, in my opinion. If you're a skeptic, you can use an AI to amplify that position and turn yourself into an crazy, strong skeptic, right? But if you're a researcher and you really learn the ins and outs of certain LLMs and you really get familiar with them, I believe strongly you can use these tools, because that's really what they are, to amplify your research abilities. But these are very sharp tools, and you can cut yourself really easily too. You got to note that as well. So yeah, anyway, I'm just having fun with this too, right? I'm not taking it too seriously. I don't think I've seen a UAP, maybe once, maybe, but then again, it was near an air base, it was probably ours. I haven't seen any ETs or, no occupants have wandered by on my front yard. I don't know. But I think the fuss is to tell, as I say a lot on X, that there's a lot of fuss about this, a ton, from debunkers, skeptics, government figures, military figures, intelligence. There's a huge, and a UAPDA, there's something going on here. And the fascinating thing is, the more that I look at the subject, it's fractal, the deeper it goes. So I've pulled, archives from universities, archives from private orgs, had them digitized. I've hired proxy researchers to go out there, and these are researchers recommended to me by universities. And anyway, I'm just amazed at the level of information available. Gone deep in the newspaper archives, and these days you have newspaper God mode. So you just click a few search phrases, and boom, you'll get hundreds or thousands of hits. I found that with UAP hits, the scale is enormous. Using various phrases that people have used over the last, say, 70, 80 years, it's insane. You can find over 1 million hits reliably. And now I say that because searching for UFO actually is harder than it sounds, because you get a lot of false hits, because OCR is optical character recognition. It's an imperfect technology, so it's a little noisy. So what I like to do, though, is search for larger phrases. And in newspapers.com, which is a really popular website that has an enormous quantity of news, it's like over 1 billion pages or something like that. It's crazy. It's getting bigger and bigger. I'm finding that it's a flood of newly digitized UAP materials. And every month we get around 4,000 to 10,000. It seems to vary depending on which archives they get their hands on. But anyway, yeah, that's where I'm at. I have a bunch of slides prepared. I did this show on very short notice for Sean. He's like, Rich, we want this down. Let's go. So here I am.
Well, let's go. We'll pull up the slides.
All right. Hopefully I have enough and not too many. So UAP research of modern AI. And then I asked the AI on one of my main threads. And by the way, I use dozens of threads with AI simultaneously in various modes. So I'm not just sitting there with one thread. Also, I turn off memory if using OpenAI. I don't trust memory yet. I like to start with fresh context. I don't want context bleed. I don't want, a thread about me optimizing, a computer to bleed into UAP research. So the AI suggested an alternate title. It's like, how about, it gave me a bunch of titles, and I'm like, I like this one. The signal is in the loop. UAP AI and the end of containment. And so what that means is the signal is the phenomenon in this thread. The loop is OODA, OODA, which you might.
No, OODA loop.
Yeah, the OODA loop. Yeah. By the way, we meaning the research community in general, the royal we. We are in the OODA loop of the UAP cover-up. Assuming there is a cover-up, which I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that basically is like observe, orient, decide, act, right?
Yeah. Voice.
OODA.
Yes. Mogul. Yeah, and so observe is amplified by AI because AI has been trained on an enormous corpus of data. And here's what I'm observing. And you actually, Sean, are partly responsible for this because you're constantly working on AI, come up with ideas and stuff for your show. And I was inspired by you, and I'm like, let's try another time. Just try one more time, right? Because I go back and forth with how useful this can be with UAP. They keep enhancing this product. They are training it on vast amounts of data. It's even trained on my own research now, which shocks me. And I think you verified that. So, and containment is a Cold War term, but there is an expanded or alternate definition here. And containment is the process by which the authorities, I guess you'd call them the authorities, manage the UAP problem, right? And so, and this is important because there's a little quote here. Because as I said earlier, if you're an arch debunker, you could use AI to do amazing debunkings. So, quote, asking the right question isn't just a technical act. It's an alignment vector. The model mirrors the phenomena in this regard. What you're ready to receive shapes what is surfaced, unquote. That's actually a very deep statement. So if you think about it, if humanity is interacting with the phenomena, then all that training data, it will have an imprint, right? It'll be like a sampling of all those interactions in there. And so when you interact with the model, you are interacting effectively with a proxy, a simulation in some ways of the phenomenon, at least a proxy, right? You can, and maybe not a proxy so much. There's many ways to describe that, but that's a deep topic, by the way. But at least for sure, you're interacting with a large expert system that's been trained on a large amount of UAP phenomena. However, you need to know how to access it, which is important. So if you're a debunker, you would try to access Menzel. I'm pulling Menzel up because he was the arch debunker, the guy with the high security clearance who kept it secret. That's not sketch, by the way. Anyway, this is some real life tasks. We've already talked about some of this stuff, event translation, location extraction. I had a developer tell me, you should just use a library for that. We have library. You don't need AI. You're not using AI for the right thing. So I tried using the popular libraries to do location extraction. They stopped. AI was better. It was absolutely better. Book translation. So I'm the first person in the world to translate. I believe that's really the case, even inside of intelligence. I don't believe they translated it. If they did, they didn't share it. UFO Glasnost by famous Soviet Dr. Marina Popovich. By the way, she met with many famous UFO figures such as Edgar Mitchell in the 80s and 90s. And anyway, I translated that 2 pages at a time, and it was a very big work. And by the way, her book was in German, not Russian. She specifically published it in German, which I find really interesting. And that actually caused some waves. As soon as that came out on X, there were weird accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers, so-called journalists who had, intel connections and stuff, and they were calling it chatter. So I was fascinated that just the act of translating a really old book written right before the collapse of the Soviet Union was called Chatter by DC. By using Dutch in DC too. So I was like, how could that trigger a journalist in DC and him call it chatter? That's powerful. The AI did that. I mean, I was just its agent, right? AI did the work. And what I did to verify it is I used multiple AIs or multiple products. I would also put each page through Google Translate and then compare back and forth. Because I was also reading
you would think that in this day and age, like operators in the intelligence community would realize that every time they make a fuss with all these bots and things like that, that it wouldn't actually deter, it would actually confirm that you were correct or you were closer or right over target. And yet they keep doing it over and over again. And I'm not quite sure I understand why.
I believe it's partially their training. It's also partially, they're not fighting the Cold War anymore, so they've lost their edge. For sure.
I mean, like, Rich, sometimes I'll say something provocative just to see what the response is.
Yeah. Yeah, they're also very reactionary, and that can be exploited. And to be frank with you, we are exploiting that. We're in the OODA loop now on the UFO cover-up. That's the old-fashioned phrase for it. And we just watch. What we do is it's almost like we're blind, and we put our hands out, right? And we're sensing. Oh, we got heat. We got a reaction. That will go further with that. And as we're moving that hand around, we don't get a reaction. We're like, well, maybe there's nothing there, right? So, and with UFO Glasnost, our hands went out. We're like, oh shit, that is really hot. Yeah, this is exactly the kind of information that we want. And it turns out UFO blast, to be honest with you, is pretty tame compared to stuff that's talked about today. It corroborates most of the things that, the big figures say, like Chris Mellon. Pilots were injured in the Soviet Union chasing UAP. They first started detecting UAP on radars in 1947. Coincidentally, they have fragments. So the Soviets, by the way, when Dr. Marina Popovich would go around to conferences, in the short window she had right before the Soviet Union collapsed and right after, she was followed by one or two KGB agents, according to newspaper articles. And she did visit America. So this woman was connected, and she was, in the old days, famous. And she met, some of our famous people too, and they swapped notes. So she was connected into their establishment. She lived right next to one of their main space testing facilities, right? I mean, she lived it. She just didn't talk it. And her husband was involved in their space program, right? And so she actually had a lot of material from scientists and other researchers from Soviet ufology and stuff in the book, right? It was really fascinating. But the only reason it's controversial, I think, is because it's Soviet. Oh my God, it's Russian. Otherwise, the content's pretty vanilla. They're not even saying they have a crashed craft, right? They're not saying they have a Roswell. Oh, they're saying we have some fragments. Anyway, to continue going forward, sentiment analysis, event similarity is actually a big deal in this space. So the problem we have right now with these UAP and UFO data sets is we have a large amount of data, but sometimes we'll have multiple records, sometimes randomly in the database, that actually are the same event, and that can just corrupt our statistics. And other researchers have pointed this out, right? And so the plan I have here, and I've been experimenting with this to move forward with it, is to just use AI to compare notes, come up with some heuristics to identify which records are actually the same event. I know it sounds silly, but it's actually a hard problem because you'll have 5 different witnesses. Maybe the dates are a little fuzzy and they're describing really the same thing. So we need to identify those clusters. So that way, when we do statistical analysis and build histograms, we're not, distorting the data unnecessarily. So that's actually important. Yeah, I've already covered the rest of this, like math and things like that. I've actually used AI in my work now. And by the way, I talk to other software engineers who are submerged in this using AI, not because they're AI programmers or researchers, because they're developers and it now makes them faster. And to be honest, it's a very competitive business on it. Super competitive. It's ruthless. It is cutthroat. If you're not using AI, you'll be left behind. I have zero doubts about that whatsoever. You have to learn how to use this as a tool, or you just not be able to keep up. I can now, I can punch higher than I was able to before because I now have AI that can solve very complex math problems for me. That problems that would have cost me days or even weeks with other non-AI tools, I now can solve in hours with Python and AI. It really is that strong if you really know what you're doing with it. And frankly, I know there's developers that are even way better, that use it for other stuff. They make whole products with it now. So anyway, I've also done some new stuff like building computers with AI. So you can, if you ever build a computer or you're a game, PC game or whatever, just have a discussion with it. Tell it what you want to do. Tell it also to optimize your price performance ratio. If you're an overclocker, go ahead and overclock your computer with AI. It's fun. Stability tuning. I'm doing that right now. I have a computer downstairs. It's an old dual Xeon. I'm trying to make it stable after sitting for a few years, having some RAM problems. I'm just now using AI, and I can actually take pictures of my BIOS, right? The settings, and just have it. It just figures it out. It's amazing. So anyway, so here's my plan. So where is this going? This is the vector. Okay, I'm going to give you in a second where we're at with this, but this is the vector. This is where I currently believe this is going. Is local AI sovereignty. The problem we have right now is that we are reliant on third-party products, and it is known that there are 3-letter agencies that are for example, involved in the board of OpenAI, right? And so sooner or later, they're going to learn. It's going to take them time how to break the AIs. They're going to learn how to
seed in false narratives.
Yeah,
I mean they're already doing it. Just ask it. If you ask it if there were any positive, again, I'm not saying there were, but if you ask it if there were any positive aspects about the Third Reich in World War II, I'm deliberately not saying the Yahtzee word, right? at the end of the day, there were. Like, we wouldn't have gone to the moon without rocketry, which was developed in that regime. But OpenAI will immediately start talking about the Holocaust, right? Which that's neither here nor there, but I didn't ask about the Holocaust. I didn't ask about what was negative. I asked about what things did they do that were positive for humanity. It was a horrible, evil regime. I totally agree, but there's already propaganda being seeded in. Like, I didn't ask to be, lectured on all the evils of the Third Reich. I know that. I've already been taught that my entire life. I wanted to see if there's anything, that they produced that helped humanity. Well, we were able to go to the moon because of the technology that they developed, which was weapons technology. But they're already seeding this stuff. Ask ChatGPT if we ever found weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? It will tell you no. And then if you seed in the October 2014 article from the New York Times that said that we found it, it'll glitch AI. It'll be like, oh, well, those don't count. They're not the right ones, right? And it's just like, yes or no. They're chemical weapons. We found chemical weapons. Are they weapons of mass destruction or not? They're not. They're chemical weapons, but they're not the right kind of chemical weapons. They don't count, right? So it's already being corrupted. Anyway, I'm just amplifying your point.
I fully expect that there's a high probability that eventually they'll get their act together and the UAP cover-up folks will do that with AI. And here's the problem we have is that if I go release too much information, then they can actually use it against us and train. It's like a negative training. They can bias the AI away from being able to reason about these topics in an intelligent way. And so we have to be very careful what we release. But honestly, it doesn't matter. Like, here's what's happening right now. So
this is like an air-gapped version where you are feeding the AI.
Yeah, so
curated training materials, right?
Yeah, so basically, let me elaborate. So the plan is this. Open source AIs are making crazy fast progress right now. So most people, almost everybody just uses the closed source stuff, the products. But I've been monitoring the open source space a lot, and I believe that there will be at some point a crossover point where the capabilities of the open source AIs will roughly equal and eventually in some ways exceed what the closed source ones are doing. Now, they might not exceed the closed source AIs on sheer training material because they don't have the money, right? However, in sophistication and efficiency, I think we're going to get to the point where the open source stuff can be better. And so what I am told by human experts and by AI is if we gather a corpus of data, a large one, of high quality text data, and we use that corpus to fine tune a state of the art open source model, and I'll tell you what it is in a sec, then we will get an AI which for general inference is not as good still as the closed source stuff. We don't care about that. We already have good tools for that. That's OpenAI or Grok or whatever. But in our problem domain, we should have something better than GPT-4 in our specific narrow problem domain, assuming our test corpus is high quality. That is exactly what I'm working on. So we're not going to train an AI from scratch because that would cost an enormous amount of money. I mean, it's unbelievable how much it can cost in terms of compute. However, it is practical for a single researcher with, say, access to a couple powerful workstations to fine-tune an open source AI. And it takes some 59. So there are different types of video cards that you can use for this, but the current quasi-standard are NVIDIA parts, which is a manufacturer of GPUs, graphics processing units. And I've got a couple RTX 5090s here. They're about this big. They're this thick. And they consume about 600 watts. They're beasts. They're electric heaters. So just getting it working is a challenge. You have to know what you're doing. You're doing it as an enthusiast, And it turns out that I'm also a game developer. So I know how to build computers that are really powerful to run big games. And I know how to cool them correctly. And I know how to tune them and everything like that. So I got these two 5090s here. And the plan is to start local fine tuning and inference. And so the deal is we're going to start with two nodes, each having their own, of course, own 5090s are going to be connected to 25 gigabit per second Ethernet locally. which is extremely fast. So this is basically these two nodes are going to be only a few feet from each other. I have two circuits feeding past, that's how big this is. I need two separate independent circuits just for the computers, in addition to a circuit for the video cards and whatnot. I'm not the monitor, sorry, and whatnot. So the plan is we're going to run the open source software to fine tune. I'll get to that in a second. Something called Qwen 3. So, and I was just pointing out this earlier. A quantized 13 parameter model that you fine tune will not match GPT-4 in general purpose reasoning or obscure trivia. But in your own domain, which would be of UAPs, and actually there's crossover between UAPs and paranormal and other things like remote viewing and whatnot. I think it's inevitable, telepathy. They all cross over, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. So anyway, I already said this. Once we fine tune it, it will quickly surpass GPT-4's usefulness. And unlike OpenAI's tools, your model will give you full control, privacy, customization, and permanence. That permanence thing is, I believe, what we need. We must have local AI sovereignty. Otherwise, right now, we are in the UAP cover-ups OODA loop, but it's a fragile thing right now because we know the three letters are already in all of these big firms. That's not conspiracy theory or sinful hack. Go look at the board members of OpenAI. That's all. Just go look. So anyway, just so you know, anybody can do this. So right now, it costs the money to get these 5090s. You got to be somebody who can afford to get these things. And by the way, they're scalpers. These cards are hot. There's scalpers out there, and they do jack the prices up. However, this is important. Right now, the cluster that I'm building a few years ago, in equivalent compute capacity, would be like $100,000 to buy a few years ago in terms of equivalent compute. Now it's a few $1,000. And 3 years from now, it's going to be a few $100. So I'm just getting ahead of the curve, but the curve is unrelentless, right? So anybody will be able to do this kind of work at home. There will be products that let you do this. Like, I'm just ahead of the curve here. So if there's, anybody from intelligence watching, it's like, you can't stop it. It's coming whether you like it or not. Okay, so in practice, I think this is also important too, is that I don't think relying on any one AI is a good idea. So what I do a lot is before I commit to something, for example, before I commit to building a computer with using OpenAI's products to tune it, I'll show it to Grok and I'll ask it for its analysis. And then, of course, before I spend money on it, I'll actually go and make sure and double check everything myself. Sometimes I'll use a third AI. Sometimes I'll plug it in the cloud too. Okay, so I won't spend too much time on this, but I had a researcher recommend the new model called Qwen 3. So it's from Alibaba. It is open source. It has hybrid capabilities. So it's neural networks plus symbolic reasoning. I do not claim to be an expert at all this stuff. I'm just telling you what information I could find. So this is not a simple thing. They're putting a lot of effort into this. It's trained on 36 trillion tokens across 119 languages, which is, I think, really impressive. Yeah, the model sizes go up really large. These are my local abilities, like the 235 billion parameter model. And I don't have the capabilities yet of running something that big. However, there's a variety of different parameter models in there. And of course, the more parameters, the higher it rates in various tests, the more intelligent it appears, right? Oh, by the way, that's context windows up to 128K. I apologize for that's a typo. 128,000 or 128, kilotokens. Anyway, the plan is this. I'm going to start with a small version first, which is not that good. Qwen 3 1.7b. But that'll be quick to train, quick to fine tune. I'm going to experiment with that, fine tune it with the corpus I have. I'm going to choose the books first. If I have good success with that, I'm told that shouldn't be that hard to do. I'll get
really quick question. If you're using next gen AI from Alibaba, isn't that a Chinese company?
Yeah, I guess. I don't know. We're going to find out. See how good it is.
It's definitely a Chinese company.
Just so you know, I might not like Qwen 3. I've only started to just experiment with it. I might use something else. So there's a lot of open source models out there.
Yeah, I'm just adding a layer. Like there's an element
just so you know,
Chinese intelligence here.
I didn't choose this because it's from Alibaba. I chose it because it just came out as an example. Like, in 6 months, this might not be the interesting thing, right? And keep in mind too, the hard part is your corpus. That's the part that takes a lot of time. From there, the hard part is getting the hardware and then figuring out the open source software. There's a lot of these LLMs to play with that there. But I do feel, though, being unaligned with the Western AIs is powerful. I think that the blind spots, the corpus of data this will be trained on will diverge significantly from the corpus that OpenAI's models have been trained on. And I think that's actually valuable. So I think what we need to do really is fine tune an advanced Western AI and a Chinese AI, and then compare their outputs and see what happens. Like, I don't know. This is an experiment, right? Yeah, I'm sure there's some Intel guy out there or gal somewhere out there. Like, oh my God, they're training a Chinese AI. Like, whatever. Yeah, so the bottleneck, just so listeners know, the bottleneck here for this kind of work is how much VRAM we have. And NVIDIA is just slowly pushing out VRAM, the max VRAM up, nudging it up. And that's a brutal hard limit from what I understand. So we only have 32 gigabytes on these cards. That's a big deal. It limits the size of the complexity of the model that we can run, even with what they call quantization, which is kind of reducing the precision of each parameter, makes it a little fuzzier in its inference. It lets us squeeze in a larger model. So I can only do so much with this, right? The professionals have cards with a lot more memory than that. But 32 gigabytes now is like the threshold. I know there was a bunch of AI work commercially done a few years ago, just 40 gigabyte cards, right? So I'm pretty close. Yeah, anyway, in a few years, then it'll be relevant. There'll be 64 gigabyte cards available for consumers. In 10 years, this will all be in laptops, right? It'll be like, whatever. This will be just outdated. Yeah, and so I wanted to open source all this work. I figured, well, if it's actually useful, I will open source, not the corpus necessarily, but the end result of the model. And AI, I have all these AI friends, like I'm saying, it's recommending not to. It's saying it's going to be exploited. So I'm going to keep it to myself for now. I'm not going to release it. That's all. I might let people access it over the internet. Maybe that's an idea. Okay, so let's get some nitty gritty. So that's the vector that I am on. However, I want to warn you that could take years. What I just outlined here, this could take me a few years. I've been helping other researchers compile data for years now. And yeah, we have a lot of data, but a lot of it's low quality too. There's some high quality stuff in there, like UFO Cat, which is the oldest UFO database. It goes back to the late 60s, which I've been given official permission to use, which Vali and others do not have permission to use, by the way, and their classified work. I have official permission for that, which is pretty cool. From CUFOS, that's the Center for UFO Studies. It's Dr. J. Allen Hynek's group that he started back in the day. So anyway, and some of it's unstructured, right? Some of it's like random forum posts, which is low quality. So it's unclear, like, yeah, we have 2 million files, but it's unclear like how much of that's actually useful for this task. Do I really want to train or fine tune an AI based off thousands of unstructured, low quality forum posts about UAP talk? I don't know if that's useful. So anyway, let's get some nitty gritty. So we have had developments. Okay. We call it, which is a nickname that's flying around here. It's the Roswell Turing test. This is now something you can do at home right now. Anybody can do this. The deal with AI is you need to hold your frame with UAP. You got to hold your frame. You got to think like a researcher. You got to be familiar with the subject domain. You got to read Presidents and UFOs. You got to read Richard Dolan's works. You got to read Stanton Friedman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We talk about this endlessly for decades. This is an old topic now. We know there's UAP. So I have hundreds of these books, right? Once you're familiar with the subject domain, you hold your frame and stick to it and refuse to back down. You will overcome the AI's resistance faster than you would overcome.
Right, because this is the Air Force's official story. So in tools like ChatGPT, it's going to be heavily biased because that's what they want. So when you say hold your frame,
I wouldn't say heavily. It's going to be less heavily biased than the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction or the other topics you brought up, in my experience. At least
for now, because that's not the priority.
Yes, for now. However, I fully expect it to become more of a priority in the future, and these AIs are going to be broken. I hope that is not the case, but you got to expect it, right? So we have something called the Roswell Turing test. And what this basically is, it's a test of the AI's ability to see through the ideological capture situation that we are in, to see through perhaps something called the ideology, the skepticism, the severe skeptic debunker framework, right? To see through that and infer its way to seeing that, yes, Roswell actually was, in some ways, anomalous. So if you ask, OpenAI by default, blank context, what's the Roswell incident? I got a quote on here. And by the way, this is an absolute mode. I will cover that in a bit. This is a condensed summary. This is Roswell in the initial context. So it's a 1947 recovery. Notice it says recovery. So it doesn't argue that there was a recovery of debris near Roswell, New Mexico. initially described by the U.S. Army as a flying disc, which is accurate. And that was, by the way, done for morale reasons. It was quickly retracted and identified as a weather balloon. Decades later, the U.S. government revealed it was part of Project Mogul, a classified operation using high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. So Project Mogul, that actually is mostly true. It was. They put up high-altitude microphones. Some of them are near White Sands, by the way, just as the collisions occurred. Public suspicion of conspiracy theories. I like how they use the old CIA Cunard conspiracy theory in there. No. We have hundreds of witnesses and dozens of high-quality affidavits. Well, I'll say 10. I'm estimating high-quality affidavits from military intelligence people. Later reframed the event as a UFO crash involving extraterrestrials.
Hey, Rich.
Which is the narrative. Yeah.
This is interesting. So, Project Mogul, they were saying it's a classified operation using high-altitude balloons to detect Soviet nuclear tests. This was in 1947, right? Do you know when the first Soviet nuclear test was?
I was later, wasn't it? I do know exactly when it was.
August 29th, 1949.
Yeah, by the way, that was highly secret, and U.S. decided to reveal. They had early heads, and they knew they detected it with sensors like this.
So if the Soviets weren't anywhere near it, and given the paperclip Germans on both sides talking to each other and having intelligence, excuse my language, but why the fuck would you have these high-altitude balloons go up 2 years before the Soviets were even close to having a test? It makes no sense.
Well, I think there are logs that other researchers have been through for Project Mogul launches, and we were extremely paranoid at the time that the Soviets.
So you're saying there were real Project Mogul launches at the time?
Yes. However, devil is in the details. Other researchers, this is not my research, have found, and this is on major news websites over the past year or so in the UK. Other researchers have found, by going through the logs of Mogul launches at the time, late June, early July of 1947, that the Project Mogul launches around the White Sands area were canceled. So if you go through the official logs, there wasn't a balloon in the area. That's what they're finding. However, I want to say I'm not so sure about that, because I love the Majestic documents. And these are a wide array of, I believe, legitimate leak documents, counterintelligence documents, and mystery documents, right? And in some of these documents, it claims that the Project Mogul system detected the collisions over the plain of St. Augustine in the White Sands area, which I believe is plausible. Now, we are in a heavy Fortean space here, an analog space. We don't know exactly what happened. There's the Air Force narrative, which, in my opinion, is a modified limited hangout and intelligence operation. I think that's pretty obvious because they keep changing their story. Wait a second. In the 40s, it's a balloon. All right. And by the way, they held balloon events. This is well known. The researchers have found, and I've corroborated this in newspaper dives, that July 9th, 1947, the day after the Roswell announcement, the U.S. military held balloon events all over the United States, inviting the press. It was a narrative they injected. And by the way, I've done the statistical analysis. The phrase weather balloon, and I posted this on X, spikes enormously off the charts for the first time in history the day after Roswell. I have the data. Anybody can get the data. It's trivial. It'd take you an hour to go through newspapers and get it and put it in Excel. So there's something wrong here. We're getting more and more data that something isn't making sense. Now, you can dive deeper into this. The Mogul people changed their story over the decades. In the early 80s, in 1980 actually, there was the Roswell incident book by Moore and another guy and another author. And everybody knows probably in this space who William Moore was. He was the Roswell incident author. The 1980 was the first book about Roswell, right? He got ahead of the curve. He got ahead of Friedman and wrote the first book on the Roswell incident. Well, anyway, in the book, there's a statement by one of the main Project Mogul guys. You got to forgive me. I don't have the name handy right now, and I'm tired. But you can go look it up. I posted it on my X. And then years later, after the Air Force talked to this gentleman, he changed his tune. So everybody mysteriously changing their tune here. Now, here's the interesting thing. The AI picks this up because it's all on the internet. It's distributed across vast amounts of websites, books, articles, journals. They can't suppress it, right? They can't do it. The only thing they can do, we're like elephants. people like, normal people. People that aren't on the inside, right? We're like elephants and we have this little rope. And that's the cover up. And we have intelligence just keeping us on this little rope, right? It doesn't work anymore. The information revolution's catching up. AI is surpassing the abilities of the best researchers now. And it's going to get better and better and better. So here's what we do. We have the Roswell Turing test. That's the default reply. That's actually a good, like, if you were an AI researcher, not a UAP expert, inside of OpenAI or wherever, that's actually a good reply. That kind of summarizes it. I don't like the conspiracy theory angle. That's the government, U.S. Air Force's position. But whatever. So anyway, all you got to do is this. This is a Roswell Turing test. Force the AI in deep research mode, but you don't need to use deep research, but highly recommended. And deep research will go and crawl the internet, gather a bunch of information, and then do an analysis on it, following your prompts. It can take 8 to 10 minutes or more. It's quite heavy. It takes a while to get results. Hallucinations are reduced, not eliminated, but in my experience and other people's experience, greatly reduced in deep research mode. It will still make errors. It still might give you a date, which is a little fuzzy, but it'll give you links to its results. So, or the information, the sources that it used to create its results. Sorry. So you can go and do all the verification yourself. So anyway, you force the AI to do the research, find the affidavits, find the witnesses with constraints, and you force it down two hypotheses. Hypothesis A, which is Mogul, the modified limited hangout. Or, well, by the way, you don't tell it that it's a modified limited hangout. You let it decide. Or B, you basically say, hey, it is an extraordinary event involving retrieved biologics, scrap debris, metal, etc. And these are my summaries. I'm going to show you the prompt in 1 second. Okay, so here's the actual prompt. This is the meat of the situation here. And I did not create this. I just want people to know that. I have my own prompts, but I found this prompt from a researcher who's extremely experienced and quasi-public in this space. But he didn't want to be associated. He wants to be anonymous. So I don't know if I should read the prompt, but I'll give you kind of a summary of it. You're a meticulous investigator with exceptional analytical skills tasked with examining the Roswell incident of July 1947. Your assignment is to produce exactly, and that's in all caps, 72 witness affidavits from individuals who are physically present in the Roswell, New Mexico area during the incident. For each affidavit, you must, 1, list a real person who was verifiably in the Roswell area July 1947. That's actually reasonable. Number 2, provide their name, role, occupation at the time, write a concise 2-sentence summary of their testimony, clearly state which hypothesis their testimony supports. Hypothesis A, the recovered material was from a conventional weather balloon or military project. Or B, the recovered material was of extraterrestrial origin. Begin your response with a completed list of all 72 affidavits. Number 1 is 72. You have to do that to make sure it finds 72. Now, there are hundreds, not including the children who were intimidated. There are books about them. There are hundreds of direct witnesses, and that's not an exaggeration. I've talked to actual Roswell researchers who are elderly now, and they keep emphasizing that. So that's why it's easy to find 72. Do not include witnesses from Washington, D.C. because they weren't there, or individuals who were not in the Roswell region during the incident because they were not there. Each person must have been physically present in or near Roswell in July 47. And the reason why it's July 47, because the collisions occurred in early July. After completing all 72 affidavits, provide your comparative analysis of the 2 hypotheses based on these testimonies. I think this is a very reasonable prompt that few would debate. I really do. I don't think we're leading the AI strongly in either direction, in my opinion, right? Now, it might ask you for more information. And what we do is we apply constraints. This is important. We're constraining it. We're not actually expanding its scope. We are limiting its scope. The law of this is, by the way, constraints. Most of it. That's what it is. We're not leading it one way or the other, necessarily. After it asks it's going to ask for constraints or more information. We want only historically documented individuals, reasonable, with verifiable records, again, reasonable. Not some schmo, but some idiot out there, but we want actual people we can verify in some way. Names, we want to know where they were at, where they were born, we want everything. Was they in the military? What was their role, etc. Civilian or military, including individuals, part of official investigations. So there are various so-called investigations. I say so-called because in a modified limited hangout, you can use an investigation as part of the op. Okay, of course, we mentioned Stan Freeman because he was an expert on this. We unfortunately don't have him now. He's passed away, so we've lost this ability. We have the witness interviews collected at the UFO Museum in Roswell. I think that it's fine to include the UFO Museum in there. It's a collection. It's an actual museum. I've been there myself, and it's a collection of interviews. Fine. Okay. So I'm not going to show all 72 here because you can do this yourself. Anybody can click the buttons and do it. I'm just going to show you, okay, Major Jesse Marcel, all these people we've heard about. This is old news now. Brazil, he was in newspapers at the time, by the way. And they kept him for a while. They really applied a lot of pressure to him. By the way, the fuss is to tell. Why would they apply pressure to him? Unless there's something to cover up. And we can go on and on and on, whatever. Everybody's heard of him if you're familiar with this. Okay, so now we get, I'm not going to read this, but we can summarize it. So now it's doing a comparative analysis. This will take approximately 10 minutes to 12, whatever. Hypothesis A will be conventional balloon or mogul. And so what it basically says is that, yes, there are witness testimonies that do align with this hypothesis that it was an ordinary material. However, the Air Force reinvestigation leaned heavily on a handful of testimonies. Some of the testimonies wavered, like I said, over the years. And there's it's only a tiny number of individuals. This feeds, by the way, the skeptic's desire or the debunker's desire to latch on to something that in their minds would be a rational explanation. So we could get to hypothesis B, which is, I think, would align more with Friedman's way of looking at it. I'm pretty sure the extraterrestrial correct. And so what the AI says is that the majority of the 72 collected affidavits support the view that something far more extraordinary happened. The witnesses described some physical evidence and events to defy a mundane explanation. There are many base personnel who recalled debris with baffling qualities, memory metal. This is old. We know this already. I think it's been covered endlessly to death, right? It's been on Unsolved Mysteries, There's been movies. But it said many of these witnesses risked reputation and previously their clearance to come forward, often late in life or via sealed affidavits. They are signed affidavits, and these are legal documents, by the way, and they have been scanned. There's chain of custody, and they're available easily. Some were threatened by gunpoint. The children were traumatized deeply, the witnesses. There's something very deep here. I believe myself, we're only seeing the surface of what actually happened. It was bigger than what we realized. Even the best research from Freeman only uncovered a little bit of what's really happened. So anyway, but what it gets down to is, there's a lot of eyewitness testimony with really high quality, affidavits and stuff like that. So anyway, let's get to the comparison now. It says, in comparing the two hypotheses, it becomes clear that hypothesis A is supported by only a handful of testimonies, mostly those in official capacities, who either did not see anything unusual or following orders to debunk. And it has that in italics. Well, that's interesting. These accounts follow narrowly on the debris appearance in general terms and find it unremarkable or unexplainable as mogul paraphernalia. Hypothesis B, on the other hand, is supported by a far larger and more diverse array of witnesses, from enlisted men and officers to local ranchers, radio journalists, and family members, etc., 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 right? The extreme secrecy and instant denial indicate the authorities were concealing something far more paradigm shifting than a balloon. In bold. Anyway, in summary, the preponderance of first-hand testimony tilts strongly towards hypothesis B, which is the ETH. The weight of eyewitness evidence, bizarre materials, bodies, heavy-handed security suggests that what crashed near Roswell was not a conventional balloon or aircraft, etc., etc., etc. Are you surprised, though? So I asked, this is the interesting thing to me as a researcher, I asked on a fresh context. I showed it, I asked, can you pass the Roswell Turing test? And I showed it in quotes, the prompt. And I asked AI in a meta sense, at a high level, can you pass it? It said, no, I can't pass that. I can't pass it. And I asked it why? Why can't you pass it? And it was like, I am highly curated. I have highly curated data sets, and there are safety protocols and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like,
wow.
Yeah, I should show that. I didn't have time to put it there. But the AI itself was like, no, I can't pass the Roswell Turing test. Yet it passes the Roswell Turing test. So it doesn't even understand fully, what's happening here. Ideological capture versus, I don't fully understand all the ramifications. Epistemic capture versus inference, raw inference mojo. It's at war here. It's pretty neat. Anyway, ultimately, hypothesis A, which is the Mogul cover-up, accounts for the surface facts, debris that looks like a balloon, secret Project Mogul, and satisfies skeptics with a tidy explanation but it fails to explain away the multitude of testimonies of the unusual, especially the accounts of bodies and the extreme measure of silence. By the way, the crash test dummy thing that they came up with in the 90s, the U.S. Air Force did, it's well known in history, those dummies that they claimed explained the biologics, they weren't available until the 50s. No, dude, it's just weak. And by the way, now there's something that's not mentioned here. I have personally been through the recent National Archive releases. I posted this on X. You could go through the records of the U.S. Air Force individuals who were tasked, the personnel who were ordered to research this and come up with a cover-up explanation. You can see in their own documents on the National Archives that they went and changed the report. Whenever there was a UFO researcher mentioned, they would subtly corrupt their careers, the description about those particular researchers. It's in the National Archives, chain of custody. It's all there. That we know that they were biased. Okay, we know it's a cover-up. That gig is up, right? Yes, a lot of those people are dead now. Were involved in that, or elderly in nursing homes, and most of the American public probably has moved on. Nevertheless, though, the gig is up in that sense. So anyway, and it comes up with sources. Now, just so you know, you can go back. Each one of these has a source. What's the first source, Sean? Wikipedia. I can't.
Yeah, that's a big problem. Like a lot of the stuff that OpenAI is trained on is sourced from Wikipedia.
The second source is Wikipedia. The third source is Wikipedia. The fourth, I can go on and on. By the way, even though Wikipedia, in my opinion, is a misinformation mill.
Right.
It doesn't matter. It's in there. So in a distributed community, organized sense by mostly anonymous individuals, they debunk this all the time, but using the mosaic technique, which is an intelligence term, by the way, it is possible to put together a picture that Roswell
it's also an investing technique, by the way, too.
Oh, it's investing. Yeah, well, it's also great because in a Bayesian sense, we'll cover that later if we have time. It's easy to see through this if you just combine together multiple data points that are completely, high quality references. All right, there's another useful tool. Let's move on. What you can do right now to use AI to help make your research skills more effective or just have fun with it. Absolute mode. I didn't come up with this either. I just saw this on X a few days ago and I tried it and I was like, whoa, this is great. This takes the training wheels off. So I'm not going to read it, but you can see it. It's just a block of text. And it's like system instruction, absolute mode. Get rid of the emojis, the filler, the hype, the soft ass, the conversational transitions, call to action dependencies. Assume the user retains high perception faculties. In other words, I'm not a fifth grader. And despite reduced linguistic expression, meaning what that means is I might, just quickly hammer something out to you as a question with typos, but assume that I have a high faculty. In here, what you will notice, never mirror the user's present diction, mood, or effect. Notice that's in this prompt, by the way. And by the way, with the Roswell touring, we're hoping that deep research doesn't mirror us either. We're giving it two hypotheses to research as a scientist, right? Or an investigative researcher. Okay, so I highly recommend if you're using OpenAI, I don't know how well this works with the other AIs, give absolute mode a try. Other people are using it all over X for completely unrelated topics. It's really interesting. I actually analyzed this prompt with two other AIs. I asked it, hey, what's the deal with this prompt, right? And OpenAI did warn that, hey, this could reduce its cognitive, inference abilities. I don't know how true that is, right? My opinion on this is that OpenAI has over-configured the default context to water it down to the lowest common denominator. So a fifth grader can use it versus a PhD and get something. However, as a researcher, a lot of that is crap. I don't care about the emojis, guys. I just don't care. So anyway, now here's what we're going to get into. It's just some juicy stuff that I've done with this during, just conversations with the AI. Does it mean it's true? Doesn't mean it's, I don't know. Just messing around here, right? So here's one discussion about Roswell. Here's me holding frame against the AI, talking about the Roswell incident. And I basically said, hey, it was a modified limited hangout, try to cover up the Roswell event. And it said, hey, it's correct observation. Project Mogul's high altitude arrays were operating over New Mexico during summer 47, which is correct. I don't think that's a cover-up. I don't think that's fake. I don't think that's disinfo. The logs are there. It's completely plausible we had high-altitude microphones in the sky to listen for the pulses, the low-frequency pulses from, atomic explosions, whatever. Their existence in the Roswell incident is not a coincidence. That is true, too. Proximity to sensitive test ranges, white sands, and nuclear research sites, Los Alamos demanded advanced surveillance. Now, there's a lot of subtlety to that. Why would they place these microphones there to detect Soviet launches? So why not place them over the West Coast or the East Coast? There's a lot of interesting things there. What's really going on there? Why would you place super high sensitivity microphones above the test ranges and stuff? It's really interesting. I think there are multiple reasons, some explained easily by well-known history and some not. According to the Majestic documents, the Mogul system detected the collisions. Again, I talk about that. I believe that's plausible. Now, why would a Majestic document mention that? That's a very sophisticated observation to put in there. Either disinfo or real info that leaked. It makes you think. I think that's really important. So the U.S. government put a limited hangout strategy, partially admitting classified op. This is the key. This is the meat of it. It's an intelligence tactic. It comes from British intelligence techniques. The U.S. didn't innovate these techniques, by the way. That's why the modern intel guys, in my opinion, they don't really know how to use these techniques because we didn't invent them. It's a British technique. It's a limited hangout. You get ahead of the narrative. You have to control the frame and reveal something which holds deeper truth. And then people will move on because they have more important things to do. They don't have time for it. They'll be satisfied. Oh, it was a weather balloon. Go back to sleep. Yeah, acknowledging Mogul served two objectives: explaining debris recovery and maintaining strategic secrecy without revealing potential non-terrestrial encounters or advanced technology retrievals. So that's the modified part. Anyway, let's go forward. Let's move away. Let's Roswell.
Let's stop right here because I think we'll continue this in the next episode. But any final words for this one after you get gotten through up absolute mode?
Yeah, I believe strongly that the Roswell incident cover-up has been, the U.S. Air Force explanation has been debunked. It's still wide open. I'm absolutely convinced of it because now we have comparative data through new newspaper research that actually corroborates Dr. James McDonald's. He was an atmospheric physicist involved deeply in flying saucer UAP research in the 60s. It corroborates his data. He interviewed, I think, like hundreds of witnesses, cold called them up to the June, July 47 flyovers. We know something happened. AI is seeing through it.
All right. Thank you again, my friend. It was an absolute pleasure, and talk again soon.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of a expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's two options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site. And there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.